The rain in Vancouver has a way of washing the color out of everything. It turns the streets into mirrors of gray steel and makes the mountains vanish behind a curtain of mist. But inside the Dairy Queen on Kingsway, the air was always thick with the smell of warm sugar, vanilla, and the hum of the freezer units. This was the world of Dorothy Ruth Stratten. She was just a child, really, 17 or 18 years old, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and blonde hair that she pulled back, trying to be practical, trying to be invisible. She didn't know she was beautiful. That was the tragedy of it, you see. She thought she was just a girl serving soft-serve cones to truck drivers and teenagers. She moved with a shy grace, wiping down the counters, unaware that she was glowing in that fluorescent light like an angel trapped in a neon box. But wolves, my dears, wolves have a way of sniffing out the lambs who don't know their own worth. Enter Paul Snider. He didn't look like a monster when he walked through those glass doors. Monsters rarely do. He looked like a man trying desperately to be someone important. He was 26, a hustler, a small-time promoter who dealt in flesh and flashy cars, strutting around Vancouver in tight pants and unbuttoned shirts, dripping in gold chains that were probably plated. He drove a Corvette that was too loud for the quiet streets. He was a man starving for fame, starving to be somebody. And when he walked up to that counter and saw Dorothy, he didn't see a person. He saw a ticket. He saw a lottery win standing there in a polyester uniform. Can you feel the ice in the air? It wasn't coming from the freezers. It was the chill of a predator locking onto its prey. He ordered a cone, but he wasn't looking at the ice cream. He was looking at her. He leaned over the counter, invading her space just enough to make her heart flutter, not with fear, not yet, but with the nervous excitement of being noticed by an older man. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she didn't belong here among the sticky tables and the crying babies. He spun stories of Hollywood, of Los Angeles, of a life where people worshipped beauty like hers. Dorothy, sweet, naive Dorothy, she blushed. She had never heard words like this. She came from a strict home, a quiet life. She didn't know the language of the hustle. She didn't know that when a man like Paul Snider tells you you're a star, he's actually pricing you for the market. He came back the next day, and the next. He brought flowers that smelled too strong. He brought jewelry that sparkled but held no weight. He waited for her shift to end, his Corvette idling in the parking lot like a growling beast in the dark. He was grooming her, peeling her away from her family, peeling her away from her friends. He made himself the center of her universe. He told her he could make her a Playboy playmate. To a girl in 1978 Vancouver, that sounded like becoming royalty. Trust me, he whispered, his hand on hers, his grip just a little too tight. I know people. I can take you there. All you have to do is listen to me. And she listened. Oh God, she listened. She looked at this man with his desperate eyes and his confident swagger, and she mistook his obsession for love. She didn't see the jealousy curling in his gut. She didn't see that he wasn't lifting her up. He was climbing on her shoulders. He convinced her to pose for nude photos. Imagine the scene. A shy girl, terrified and trembling, undressing in a cold room while this man, her boyfriend, snapped pictures, telling her it was art, telling her it was for her future. He was capturing her soul on film, stealing pieces of her dignity one snapshot at a time, preparing to sell her to the highest bidder. He sent the photos to Playboy. He packaged her up like a prize steer. And when the call came, when the magazine expressed interest, Paul Snider smiled. But it wasn't a smile of joy for her success. It was the baring of teeth. He had his hook in her now. He told her they were going to Los Angeles. They were going to the city of angels. He didn't tell her that he was bringing the devil with them. He packed their bags, and Dorothy looked back at the rainy streets of Vancouver one last time, thinking she was escaping a dull life. She didn't know she was stepping into a cage that would only open one more time, for her funeral. The California sun didn't just shine, it glared. It stripped away secrets and left you exposed. For Dorothy, Los Angeles was a kaleidoscope of blinding lights and noise, a world away from the misty silence of British Columbia. But for Paul Snider, it was the hunting ground he had always dreamed of. He drove their rental car down Sunset Boulevard like he was the king of the concrete jungle, one hand on the wheel, the other gripping Dorothy's knee just a little too hard. He was sweating, always sweating, a sheen of desperation that no amount of air conditioning could dry. He had brought his prize heifer to market, and he was practically vibrating with the anticipation of the sale. Dorothy was terrified. You have to remember, she was a baby, 18 years old. She clutched her purse in her lap, her knuckles white, staring out at the palm trees that looked less like paradise and more like jagged teeth against the blue sky. Paul told her to smile. "You're going to be a star, babe," he'd say, snapping his fingers to the radio. But the way he said it, it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like an order. It sounded like a threat. They arrived at the gates of the Playboy mansion. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress. A kingdom of stone and ivy where the most beautiful women in the world walked around like peacocks, untouchable and serene. And here came Paul, the pimp from Vancouver, dragging innocent Dorothy Stratten into the lion's den. The people at Playboy, the editors, the photographers, the man himself, Hugh Hefner, they saw it immediately. They saw the fresh-faced, stunning beauty of Dorothy, a girl who looked like she was made of strawberries and cream and pure light. And then they saw the man standing next to her. The stain on the silk. Paul was loud. He was crass. He wore his shirts unbuttoned too low, his gold chains clinking like cheap wind chimes. He tried to shake hands with the executives, tried to talk biz, tried to act like a Hollywood player. But everyone could smell the desperation on him. It reeked like stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. They wanted Dorothy. They loathed Paul. They looked at him like he was something they had stepped in. But Dorothy, oh, sweet, loyal, tragic Dorothy. She wouldn't let go of his hand. She introduced him to everyone with a shy pride. "This is Paul. He discovered me. He's the reason I'm here." She thought she owed him her life. She didn't realize he was actually taking it. The photo shoot happened quickly. They made her a bunny at the club. Then, the big one, the centerfold. August 1979. Miss August. But before the fame truly hit, Paul felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. He was street smart, in a feral kind of way. He saw how the men looked at her, not just with lust, but with a kind of reverence. And he saw how they looked at him, with sneering disgust. He knew, deep down in his dark, twisted heart, that she was going to outgrow him. She was a swan, and he was the muddy, stagnant pond she was swimming in. So he made his move. He had to lock the door before the bird realized the cage was open. June 1979. Las Vegas. It wasn't a fairy tale wedding in a cathedral with bells ringing. It was a desperate, sweaty dash to the desert. Paul pushed for it. He demanded it. He needed the paper. He needed the legal bind. He needed to own her, not just emotionally, but by the law of the land. Dorothy wore a simple white dress, looking less like a bride and more like a sacrifice at the altar. Paul stood there in his flashy suit, sweating under the neon lights, slipping a ring on her finger that felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love. She said, "I do," because she thought that's what love was. You stick by the person who brought you to the dance. You don't abandon the one who made you. She didn't see the trap snapping shut. She didn't hear the heavy iron bolt sliding into place. Back in Los Angeles, the control tightened like a noose. He began to dictate what she wore. Too covered up, he'd sneer, pulling at her neckline. Show more leg. You're a star. Act like it. He monitored her phone calls. He drove her everywhere. He was her chauffeur, her manager, her husband, her jailer. And the darkness began to bleed into the dream. In the quiet of their apartment, the mask would slip completely off. If she smiled at another man, Paul would rage. Not a yell. That would be too easy. It was a low, simmering hiss. He would remind her that she was nothing without him. "I made you," he would whisper in the dark, his breath hot against her ear. "You were scooping ice cream. You were a nobody. You belonged to me." Dorothy would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the California moon casting long, prison bar shadows across the bed. She was becoming the most desired woman in America, yet she was the loneliest girl in the world. She was starting to realize that the man sleeping next to her, the man whose heavy breathing filled the room, was not her savior. He was a parasite. And parasites, my dears, they don't let go until they've drained you dry. The honeymoon was over before it even began, and the nightmare was just starting to stretch its legs. The Playboy Mansion West wasn't just a house of stone and ivy. It was a separate planet with its own gravity, its own laws, and its own gods. And in this kingdom of eternal twilight and flowing champagne, Dorothy Stratten was the new sun. She didn't just walk into the room, she floated. There was a purity to her that the other women, hardened by the industry, cynical and sharp-edged, simply didn't have. She was the girl next door if the girl next door was a goddess in disguise. Hugh Hefner, the king on his velvet throne, saw it instantly. He didn't just see a centerfold. He saw the next Marilyn Monroe. He saw vulnerability wrapped in perfection. He took her under his wing, treating her with a fatherly affection that bordered on obsession. She was the jewel and the crown of his empire, the symbol of everything Playboy wanted to be, innocent yet desirable, attainable yet divine. But where there is a sun, there must be a shadow, and that shadow was Paul Snider. If Dorothy was the guest of honor, Paul was the uninvited ghost haunting the buffet table. He walked through the grotto and the game rooms with a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. He wore his insecurities like a neon sign. While Dorothy was being whisked away for private conversations with directors and producers, Paul was left standing by the pool, clutching a drink, sweating in his polyester suits. He tried to mingle. God, he tried. He'd corner famous actors, producers, anyone who would listen, and launch into his frantic, fast-talking hustles. "I'm her manager," he'd say, thumbing at Dorothy across the room. "I discovered her. We're a team." But the eyes of the Hollywood elite are cold, and they are sharp. They looked at Paul and saw a pimp. They saw a leech. They saw a man who had stumbled upon a gold mine and was desperately trying to convince everyone he was a geologist. The whispers started. "Who is that guy? Why is she with him? He's a disaster." They laughed at his Jewish star necklace nestled in his chest hair. They laughed at his loud car. They laughed at his desperation. And Paul, he heard them. Even when they didn't speak, he heard them. The silence when he walked into a room was deafening. Hefner despised him. The staff at the mansion tolerated him only because they loved Dorothy. They treated him like a stray dog that had followed the princess home. You don't kick it, but you definitely don't let it on the furniture. Paul, was banned from the inner sanctum. When Dorothy was invited to the upstairs screenings or the private dinners, Paul was often left downstairs, or worse, not invited at all. He would wait for her in the car or pace the grounds, his mind rotting with paranoia. He watched her from afar, laughing at jokes he didn't hear, smiling at men who possessed power he could only dream of. Every smile she gave another man felt like a knife in his gut. Every time she looked happy without him, it was a betrayal. He began to see the mansion not as a playground, but as a theft in progress. They were stealing his creation. They were reprogramming his robot. He would drive her home in silence, the air in the car thick and poisonous. He wouldn't hit her, not yet, but he would slice her with words. "You think you're better than me now?" He'd sneer as they pulled into their driveway. "You think those people care about you? They only want one thing. I'm the only one who loves you. Me. Only me." He was trying to shrink her back down to size, trying to crush the confidence that was blooming in her chest. But it was too late. The world had seen her light. She was meeting people who told her she was smart, that she was talented, that she had a future beyond just being a body. She was starting to realize that the leash around her neck wasn't protection, it was a noose. And Paul, sitting in the dark of their bedroom while she slept, watched her chest rise and fall and realized with a terrifying clarity, she is slipping away. The golden ticket is floating out of my hands. The beast inside him began to pace. If he couldn't keep her by climbing up to her level, he would have to drag her down to hell with him. The year 1980 arrived like a fever dream. The decade of excess was just booting up, and standing right at the center of the spotlight was Dorothy. Playboy named her Playmate of the Year. This wasn't just an award, it was a coronation. She was the absolute ideal, the golden girl of the new era. She was given cash, gifts, and a brand new Jaguar XJS. But for Paul Snider, this wasn't a celebration of Dorothy. It was the validation of his project. He looked at her success and saw his own reflection. He took that Jaguar and slapped a custom vanity license plate on it, Star 80. That plate tells you everything you need to know about the horror that was brewing. He didn't see a wife. He saw a vehicle. He saw a product stamped with a model year. Star 80. It was possessive. It was branding. He drove that car around Los Angeles like a Roman chariot, honking at pedestrians, grinning that wide, frantic, terrifying grin. "That's my wife," he'd tell anyone who looked, pointing to the magazine on the dashboard. "I built that." But the foundation of his building was rotting. The more Dorothy shone, the darker Paul's shadow became. He wasn't being invited to the parties anymore. He wasn't the cool manager. He was the baggage. And baggage gets left at the claim check. He began to suffocate her. It wasn't enough to just be married. He had to be inside her head. He monitored her schedule like a warden. If she was 5 minutes late coming home from an acting class, the interrogation would start. "Who were you with? Did a guy talk to you? Did you smile at him?" He wasn't asking out of love. He was asking out of inventory control. He was so terrified of losing his possession that he started hiring private investigators. Not because she was cheating, she wasn't, but because he was terrified she might realize she could. He needed eyes on her when he couldn't be there. He was tracking a satellite that was slowly, inevitably drifting out of his orbit. And Dorothy, the sweet, compliant girl from the dairy farm, began to feel the walls closing in. She was working now, really working. She was landing roles in movies like Galaxina and Skatown, USA. She was meeting people who spoke to her about art, about feelings, about the future. They didn't talk about marketing or packages or flesh. They treated her like a human being. She started to see the difference between love and ownership. Paul sensed this shift like a shark senses a drop of blood in the water. He ramped up the psychological warfare. He would tell her she was fat. He would tell her she looked tired. He would pick apart her appearance just before she went to an audition, trying to shatter her confidence so she would come running back to him for glue. But the glue was dry. The Star 80 plate was starting to look less like a trophy and more like a tombstone. He was losing his grip, and for a man like Paul Snider, a man built entirely on ego and hustle, loss of control is a fate worse than death. It breeds a special kind of rage, the rage of a child whose toy is being taken away. He sat in their apartment, surrounded by posters of her, photos of her, magazines of her, realizing that the image was all he had left. The real Dorothy was waking up. An awaking dreamer is a nightmare for the monster under the bed. New York City, spring of 1980. The air was different here. It didn't smell like desperate cologne and car exhaust. It smelled of rain on hot asphalt, of old subways, of history. For Dorothy, stepping onto the streets of Manhattan was like stepping out of a suffocating room and taking her first real breath of oxygen. She was here to film They All Laughed, a romantic comedy. And the cast? It was royalty. She was working alongside the legendary Audrey Hepburn. Imagine that. The girl who scooped ice cream in Vancouver was now sharing a frame with the woman who ate breakfast at Tiffany's. It should have been a dream come true. But the real dream wasn't the movie. It was the man behind the camera. Peter Bogdanovich was everything Paul Snider was not. He was an intellectual, a celebrated director, a man who spoke in paragraphs, not sales pitches. When Peter looked at Dorothy, he didn't zoom in on her chest or her legs. He looked at her face. He looked into those sad, stormy eyes and saw a soul. That was begging to be understood. He treated her with a gentleness she had never known. He didn't order her around. He asked her what she thought. He asked her how she felt. He brought her flowers, not the cheap, gas station bouquets Paul used to buy to apologize for a fight, but thoughtful arrangements meant simply to make her smile. On the set, amidst the chaos of filming, a quiet, tragic love story began to bloom. It wasn't a sordid affair. It was an awakening. For the first time in her short life, Dorothy realized that love wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about debt. It was about being seen. Peter told her she was talented. He told her she had a future as a serious actress. He stripped away the Playmate label and found the woman underneath. They would walk through the city, talking for hours, and with every conversation, the chains Paul had wrapped around her mind began to rust and snap. Back in Los Angeles, the silence from New York was deafening. Paul sat by the phone, staring at it like it was a bomb about to go off. He called her constantly, his voice shrill and panicked. "When are you coming back? Who are you with? I heard you're with him." The predator's instinct was tingling. He could feel her drifting. He could feel the golden goose preparing to fly the coop. He tried to guilt her, tried to threaten her, tried to play the victim. "I'm nothing without you, Dorothy. You owe me." But the spell was breaking. Being with Peter showed Dorothy the stark, horrifying contrast of her marriage. She looked at Peter, kind, successful, loving, and then she looked back at the memory of Paul, sweaty, controlling, volatile. The choice wasn't just between two men. It was a choice between life and a slow, suffocating death. She fell in love with Peter, yes, but more importantly, she fell in love with the idea of freedom. She realized she didn't need the wolf of Vancouver. She was a swan, and she had found her lake. But hope is a dangerous thing in a horror story. Hope is what makes you drop your guard. Dorothy began to believe she could just leave. She thought she could negotiate with a terrorist. She thought she could explain to Paul that it was over and he would understand. She didn't realize that by finding her voice, by standing up and choosing her own happiness, she wasn't just ending a marriage. She was signing a death warrant. The awakening was beautiful, vibrant, and full of promise. But 3,000 miles away, in a dark room in West LA, the darkness was loading a weapon. The distance between New York and Los Angeles is roughly 3,000 miles. But in the summer of 1980, it might as well have been the distance between heaven and hell. Dorothy was in the light, breathing the rare air of artistic freedom, while Paul was down in the smog, choking on his own bile. When the letters arrived, they didn't land like love notes. They landed like subpoenas. Dorothy, bless her naive heart, tried to let him down with the grace of a saint. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She wrote about finding herself. She wrote about the need to grow, to stand on her own 2 feet, to see the world through her own eyes and not just through the lens of his camera. She called him her best friend. She thanked him for discovering her. She thought she was being kind. She thought that if she acknowledged his role in her past, he would release her into her future. She didn't understand that you cannot reason with a parasite. You cannot explain growth to a man whose entire identity is built on your stagnation. Paul read those letters in the silence of the empty house in West Los Angeles, a house she paid for, surrounded by furniture she bought. He didn't see a young woman spreading her wings. He saw an investment walking out the door. He saw the Star 80 license plate rusting in the driveway. He saw the end of the free ride. And the rage, it wasn't a fire. It was a cold, black oil slick coating his insides. He crumpled the paper, his hands shaking. Not with sorrow, but with the terrifying vibration of a man losing his grip on reality. He started pacing the floorboards, muttering to the empty rooms, rehearsing arguments that would never happen, screaming at the ghosts of the Hollywood executives he felt were laughing at him. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't. So, he did what desperate, small men do. He tried to dig up dirt on an angel. He hired a private investigator. He wanted proof. He needed to know who was stealing his property. He needed a name, a face, a target. The investigator did his job too well. He tracked Dorothy's movements in New York. He watched the way she looked at Peter Bogdanovich. He watched the way they moved together, not like a director and a star, but like 2 magnets finally finding their polarity. When the report came back, confirming the affair, it didn't just break Paul's heart. It shattered his ego. Peter Bogdanovich, a famous director, a rich man, a man with real power. Paul Snider, the pimp from Vancouver, the hustler with the gold chains and the polyester suits, was being replaced by legitimate Hollywood royalty. The humiliation was absolute. He felt like the entire city was pointing a finger at him. He could hear the whispers in every restaurant he wasn't invited to, in every club that wouldn't let him in. There goes Paul Snider. His wife finally woke up. He's nothing now. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He existed on a diet of paranoia and obsession. He would sit in the dark, fondling the merchandise, the posters, the magazines, the photos, trying to reclaim the ownership he felt slipping away like sand through his fingers. He started telling people bizarre, frightening things. I'd rather see her dead than with him. He'd mutter to acquaintances, a glaze over his eyes that made them step back, made them check the exits. He was broadcasting his intent, screaming it into the void, but in the whirlwind of Los Angeles, where everyone is screaming for attention, no one recognized. the sound of a bomb ticking down. He was isolated, humiliated, and armed with the most dangerous weapon a narcissist can possess: the realization that he has nothing left to lose. The heat in Los Angeles on August 13th, 1980, was oppressive. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, the kind that made tempers flare and patience evaporate. But inside the mind of Paul Snider, the chaotic storm had suddenly quieted. The panic, the frantic begging, the sweating desperation, it was all gone. It had been replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. He had stopped trying to solve the problem of his crumbling life. He had decided, instead, to end it. He sat at the kitchen table of the house in West Los Angeles, the house that Dorothy's centerfold money had rented, scanning the classified ads in the local paper. He wasn't looking for a job. He wasn't looking for a new apartment. His finger traced down the columns until it stopped on a small, innocuous listing: 12-gauge shotgun for sale. Mossberg 500. It was a private seller. No waiting period. No background check. Just cash and a handshake. Paul drove to meet the seller with a terrifying calmness. He didn't look like a man about to commit an atrocity. He looked like a man running a simple errand. He inspected the weapon. It was heavy, dark, and smelled of gun oil and steel. It was a pump-action shotgun, a weapon designed for stopping power, for destruction. He racked the slide. Click-clack. The sound was loud, unmistakable, and final. He paid the man, took the gun, and drove back to the house on Arundel Place. He told his roommates, with a flat, empty look in his eyes, that he was going hunting. They looked at him, confused. Paul Snider, the Jewish pimp from Vancouver in his silk shirts and loafers. Hunting? In the city? He didn't own hiking boots. He didn't know the first thing about the wilderness. But they didn't push him. Maybe they were afraid to. Maybe the darkness radiating off him was enough to make them look away. He took the gun into his room, the room he used to share with Dorothy, and he waited. Meanwhile, Dorothy had flown back to Los Angeles. She was glowing. The time in New York with Peter Bogdanovich had changed her. She felt stronger, more independent. She was in love, and she believed, with the tragic optimism of the young and kind-hearted, that she could handle Paul. She thought she could talk to him one last time, explain that she wanted a divorce, settle the financial matters, and walk away clean. She wanted to be fair. She wanted to give him some money, let him keep the car, help him land on his feet. She couldn't bear the thought of him suffering, even after everything he had done to control her. Her friends were terrified. Don't go, they begged her. Don't go to that house alone. Peter Bogdanovich, miles away, felt a sick dread in the pit of his stomach. He urged her to stay away, to let lawyers handle it. He's unstable, Dorothy. He's dangerous. But Dorothy shook her head. I know him, she said, her voice soft. He's hurt. He's sad. But he wouldn't hurt me. I owe him this. I need to look him in the eye and say goodbye. She didn't understand that the man she knew didn't exist anymore. That man had been consumed by the monster. The Paul she was going to see wasn't her husband. He was a walking executioner. She spent the evening of the 13th preparing, gathering her thoughts, maybe even rehearsing the gentle words she would use to let him down easy. She packed her purse. She had about $1,100 in cash to give him, a peace offering. As the sun went down over the Hollywood Hills, casting long, bloody shadows across the city, Paul sat in his room with the shotgun. He wasn't planning a negotiation. He wasn't planning a divorce settlement. He was planning an annihilation. The trap was set. The bait, his own pathetic neediness, had worked. She was coming. And this time, He would make sure she never, ever left him again. The sun was high now. It was noon. In Los Angeles, August 14th, 1980. The shadows had retreated, leaving everything exposed under the harsh, bright light of reality. But at the house on Clarkson Road in West Los Angeles, the darkness was just beginning to settle in. Dorothy Stratten pulled her car up to the curb. It was a nondescript vehicle, a rental, not the flashy Jaguar with the Star 80 plates. That car, the symbol of Paul's ownership, was parked in the driveway, gleaming like a polished weapon. Dorothy sat in her car for a moment, the engine idling. She checked her makeup in the rearview mirror. She looked tired, perhaps a little pale, but her eyes still held that spark of hope. She touched the envelope in her purse. Inside was $1,000 in cash. It wasn't a payoff, it was a lifeline. She was going in there to cut the cord, yes, but she wanted to leave him with something to hold on to. She wanted to leave him with dignity. She stepped out of the car. The heat hit her instantly, a physical weight. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep breath of the thick, smoggy air, and walked up the driveway. The house was a modest, two-story stucco affair, the kind of place where aspiring actors and students lived, dreaming of better days. It looked so normal. A garden hose coiled on the lawn, a newspaper on the porch. It didn't look like a slaughterhouse. Inside, Paul Snider was waiting. He had spent the morning pacing, checking the window, checking the clock. When he saw her pull up, a strange calm washed over him. He turned to his roommate, a young doctor named Stephen Kushner, who was lounging in the living room. "She's here," Paul said. His voice was flat. "Why don't you take a walk? Give us some privacy. We have things to discuss." Kushner looked at Paul. He saw a man who looked composed, maybe a little too composed given the wreckage of his marriage. He didn't see the gun hidden in the bedroom. He didn't see the madness that had calcified behind Paul's eyes. He just saw a husband about to have a difficult conversation with his estranged wife. So he nodded. "Sure, Paul. Good luck." As Kushner walked out the front door, he passed Dorothy on the walkway. She smiled at him, that famous, radiant smile that had launched 1,000 ships. "Hi, Steve," she said, her voice light and musical. She seemed relieved to see a friendly face. She seemed safe. Kushner smiled back, got in his car, and drove away. He left her there. He left her alone at the edge of the abyss. Dorothy reached the front door. She didn't knock. It was still technically her house. She turned the knob and pushed it open. The living room was quiet. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the blinds. The air smelled of stale coffee and something else, something metallic, something old. Paul was standing there. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't crying. He was just watching her. He looked at her like a collector looking at a rare butterfly he was about to pin to a board. "Hello, Paul," she said softly. She stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. That sound, the latch engaging, was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a prison cell locking. It was the sound of the air being sucked out of the room. They moved to the bedroom. Her old bedroom. The room where she had slept, where she had dreamed, where she had once thought she loved this man. It was messy. Clothes were piled on the floor. The bed was unmade. It smelled of him. That mix of cologne and sweat that used to comfort her, but now made her stomach turn. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her purse. She tried to keep her voice steady. She tried to be the reasonable one. "Paul, we need to talk about the divorce," she began. "I want to help you. I brought you some money." She reached into her purse. She pulled out the envelope. She held it out to him, a peace offering. Paul didn't look at the money. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He saw the pity in her eyes, and it burned him like acid. Pity. That was all she had left for him. Not love. Not fear. Just pity. The final insult. He didn't take the envelope. He turned his back to her, walking toward the closet. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice low, muffled by the clothes hanging there. "Is that all I'm worth to you now? $1,000 and a goodbye?" "No, Paul," she pleaded, standing up. "It's not like that. I just want us both to be happy. I want you to be okay." He spun around. In his hands, he wasn't holding a photo album. He wasn't holding a tissue. He was holding the Mossberg 500. The barrel was black and cold, a void that swallowed the light. He pumped it. Cack. Dorothy froze. The breath caught in her throat. The world stopped spinning. She looked at the gun, then at his face. The man she knew was gone. The hustler, the promoter, the husband, they had all vanished. Standing before her was only the wolf. And the wolf was hungry. "Sit down," he whispered. She sank back onto the bed, her legs suddenly useless. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, the world went on. Cars drove by. Birds sang. Neighbors mowed their lawns. But inside that room, time had run out. The negotiation was over. The settlement had been rejected. The bedroom on Arundel Place became a vacuum. The air didn't move. The dust didn't settle. Time itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable crack of thunder that would shatter the world. Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes fixed on the man who had once been her husband. But Paul Snider was no longer a man. He was a vessel of pure, distilled resentment. He stood there, the shotgun heavy in his hands, looking at her not with anger, but with a terrifying, hollow possessiveness. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He just looked at her like a child looks at a broken toy he refuses to throw away. "I loved you," he whispered, the words sounding like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "I made you. You were nothing. You were scooping ice cream. I gave you the world." Dorothy tried to speak, tried to summon the strength she had found in New York, the strength Peter had helped her build. "Paul, please," she said, her voice barely a tremor in the suffocating silence. "We can work this out. It doesn't have to be like this. Put the gun down." But words were useless now. They were raindrops falling into a volcano. Paul wasn't listening to her. He was listening to the voices in his own head, the chorus of humiliation that had been screaming at him for months. He saw the Star 80 vanity played in his mind. He saw the way the Hollywood elite looked through him. He saw Dorothy, glowing and beautiful, ascending to a plane of existence he could never reach. And the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. If I can't have her, no one can. If I can't own the star, I will extinguish the light. He raised the shotgun. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. Dorothy gasped, a sharp intake of breath that would be her last connection to the living world. She looked into the black bore of the weapon, and in that split second, she didn't see a bullet. She saw the end of everything. She saw the dairy in Vancouver. She saw the rain. She saw the lights of the Playboy mansion. And then, she saw nothing. The blast was deafening. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that tore through the room. A single shot from the 12 gauge, fired at point-blank range, struck Dorothy in the face. It was instantaneous. There was no pain, no struggle, just the sudden, brutal cessation of a life that was just beginning to bloom. The girl who wanted to be an actress, the girl who wrote poetry, the girl who just wanted to be kind, she was gone. Her body slumped backward onto the bed, a broken doll in a room that smelled of gunpowder and death. The silence that followed was heavier than the shot. It was a silence that screamed. But the horror wasn't over. God, if only it were. Paul Snider stood over the body of his wife, the smoke curling from the barrel of the gun. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't call the police. He looked at what he had done, and the madness that had been simmering in his brain boiled over into something truly demonic. He was alone with her now. Finally alone. No Peter Bogdanovich. No Hugh Hefner. No lawyers. Just Paul and his creation. In the next hour, a scene unfolded that defies comprehension, a descent into depravity that haunts the annals of Hollywood history. Paul didn't recoil from the carnage. Instead, he embraced it. He assaulted her. He violated the body of the woman he claimed to love, engaging in acts of necrophilia that turned the tragedy into a grotesque nightmare. It was the ultimate act of objectification. To him, she wasn't a person anymore. She was property. She was a thing to be used, to be consumed one last time before the darkness took them both. He arranged her body on a bondage device he had built, posing her in death as he had controlled her in life. It was a final, sick assertion of dominance, a scream of mine written in blood. He spent nearly an hour in that room with the dead. An hour of madness. An hour of hell. Then, the adrenaline faded. The reality of the red-soaked room began to close in. The walls were watching him. The silence was judging him. He knew there was no way out. The script was finished. The movie was over. He picked up the shotgun one last time. He sat down near the body, near the ruin of the beauty he had destroyed. He placed the muzzle of the weapon against his own head. Click-clack. The second shot rang out, a dull thud that echoed through the quiet house. And then, finally, there was peace. Two bodies lay in the room, bound together in a gruesome tableau of love gone wrong, while outside, the Los Angeles sun continued to shine, indifferent to the darkness that had just swallowed a star. The sun began to dip low over Los Angeles, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Inside, the house on Arundel Place, the silence was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. The air conditioning hummed, a mechanical prayer for the dead, circulating air that now reeked of copper and gunpowder. Around 11 p.m., the private investigator, a man named Wayne Gully whom Paul had hired to stalk Dorothy, arrived at the house. He had been trying to reach Paul all day. The phone had rung and rung, echoing in the empty hallway, unanswered. A knot of dread, tight and cold, had formed in Gully's stomach. He knew Paul was volatile. He knew the man was a powder keg, and he knew Dorothy was coming over. Gully met the roommates outside. They stood on the lawn, shifting uncomfortably. "He's in there with her," one of them said, gesturing to the dark window of the bedroom. "They've been in there for hours." No sound. Nothing. Fear is a contagion. It jumped from man to man. They moved toward the bedroom door, their footsteps slow, hesitant. They knocked. "Paul." Silence. "Paul, are you in there?" Nothing but the hum of the AC. Gully tried the knob. Locked. He put his ear to the wood. No breathing. No movement. Just a terrifying void. He looked at the roommates, his face pale in the dim hallway light. "We have to go in," he whispered. They moved to the window outside, peeling back the edge of the curtain to peek into the abyss. What they saw broke them. It wasn't just a murder scene. It was a tableau of horror. A slaughterhouse arranged by a madman. The moonlight filtered in, illuminating the carnage. Dorothy, beautiful, vibrant Dorothy, was draped across the low bondage machine Paul had constructed, her body ravaged, her face destroyed. And Paul lay curled in a corner, the shotgun beside him like a lover, his head shattered. The walls were splattered with the final, violent punctuation of their marriage. The men recoiled, stumbling back into the cool night air, gasping, retching, their minds struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated evil they had just witnessed. The police arrived in a swarm of red and blue lights, slicing through the quiet neighborhood. They taped off the house, turning the sanctuary into a crime scene. The coroners brought out the black bags. One for the monster, one for the angel. The news hit Hollywood like a physical blow. Hugh Hefner, the king of the empire, was reportedly so shaken he suffered a minor stroke. The Playboy mansion, usually a place of revelry, fell into a stunned, mournful silence. But the devastation was most acute in New York. Peter Bogdanovich received the call that ended his life as he knew it. He collapsed. The woman he loved, the woman he was going to marry, the woman he had just saved, was gone. He would spend years trying to vindicate her, writing the killing of the unicorn, blaming Hefner, blaming the culture, blaming everyone who treated Dorothy as a commodity instead of a human being. But blame couldn't bring her back. Dorothy Stratten was 20 years old. She was a girl who loved poetry. She was a girl who worked at a Dairy Queen and dreamed of magic. She was chewed up by the machinery of fame and spit out by a man who couldn't stand to see her shine without him. She became the tragic cautionary tale of the industry, the star 80 license plate forever serving as her epitaph. In the end, Paul Snider got exactly what he wanted. He linked his name to hers for eternity. You cannot tell the story of the beauty without telling the story of the beast. He dragged her down into the dark with him, ensuring that whenever people looked at her glowing, perfect photos, they would also see the shadow of the man holding the shotgun. The house on Arundel Place was eventually cleaned. New tenants moved in. The blood was scrubbed away. But the story remains, a haunting scar on the face of Hollywood. It whispers to every young girl who steps off a bus with a suitcase full of dreams. Beware the wolves who tell you you're a star. They don't want to help you shine. They just want to own the light.